Hello ladies and gentlemen. This is Karen Sharp again. I am here with Professor Randolph Hemmings. Today the professor will tell part 4, the last session of the 4-part series on the origins of the US color line.
Thank you, Karen. This is session C8. Why? What did the color line accomplish? To recap, the United States is unique in preserving a genetic enclave of mostly African ancestry, resulting from an intermarriage barrier imposed in 1691. Today we ask why. What on earth did the colonial rulers have in mind when they invented an endogamous barrier? When they turned what they themselves considered the holy sacrament of matrimony into a crime? Well, King William III back in England was horrified. He wanted this question answered, as did the Lords of Trade and Plantations in London. And so, a series of letters between Virginia Governor William Gooch and Attorney General Richard West debated this very policy. Why criminalize a sacrament? Here was the problem. The late 17th century Chesapeake colonies had a problem that no other New World colony ever faced. Dozens of slave insurrections had flared up around the hemisphere. Some were successful. Some were not. But even unsuccessful slave rebellions bankrupted colonies. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 came within a whisker of ending the Chesapeake colonies. Forced laborers, black and white, threw off their chains. They formed themselves into an army. They defeated the planters' militia in battle. They then besieged the colonial governor in Jamestown, until they were finally crushed by imperial troops brought all the way from England. You see, slave economies can survive only if they have a buffer class, a yeoman class of subsistence farmers. This class is allowed to live outside of the forced labor economy. In return, they agree to take up arms, to crush any slave rebellion that might arise. In the British West Indies, these were the Maroons. They were the result of intermarriage between Europeans and Africans. The Spanish used Native Americans to this end. But the Chesapeake had no such buffer class. No one in the Chesapeake, other than the handful of planters themselves, had a vested interest in taking up weapons to crush slave rebellions. To survive as a colony, the rulers had to create such a buffer class overnight. But, as it turns out, the Chesapeake colonies also had a very strange and unique demographic distribution. Out of the 15,000 colonists in 1690, 9,000 of them were forced laborers. And out of those 9,000 forced laborers, 7,000 were Europeans. Only 2,000 were Africans. In all of the New World, only the Chesapeake colonies had more European than African forced laborers. And so, for the colony to survive, the rulers came up with the idea of splitting all three social classes into two races, one called white and the other black. Today, you can still read the letters between Gooch and West, where they explained in detail how they were going to go about it. The plan was that eventually all Europeans, of every class, would be freed from forced labor. This would create the desperately needed yeoman buffer class. And eventually all Africans of every class would become hereditary slaves. The most serious obstacle to the plan was that colonists had intermarried for generations. Consequently, many colonists were of dual ancestry. And these were likely to resist the imposed dichotomy. Official persecution would work only as a temporary measure. A permanent solution to the problem of dual heritage colonists was needed, one that prevented their ever being born. As Gooch explained in a 1723 letter to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, the new endogamous color line depended on colonists being sensible that a distinction ought to be made between Negro offspring and the descendants of an Englishman. Gooch spelled out that Virginia's necessary, but still weak color line was in jeopardy from multiracial colonists, who were descended from a white father or mother. Criminalizing intermarriage, he wrote, was a way of discouraging that kind of copulation. In short, in order for the colony to survive, they had to create a buffer class overnight. In order to create a buffer class, they had to impose a dichotomous color line. In order to make the color line work, They had to stop the emergence of colonists of dual heritage, whatever the cost. And so they did. They made intermarriage a crime. And, with that, I conclude today's presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Hemmings. A viewer says that banning intermarriage in order to divide and conquer was not original with the Chesapeake rulers.
That is correct. It is a very old control method. 40 years earlier, predecessors of colonial leaders had served with Cromwell in Ireland. They had outlawed Irish-English intermarriage in order to prevent rebellion there. And 30 years before that, their predecessors returned from the East India Company's expedition to Gujarat, telling everyone how the Hindu caste system had kept order in India for over 3,000 years by enforced endogamy.
A viewer wanted to know how the landed gentry got the authority to hire and fire ministers and bishops. Was the church not independent in America?
The Church of England was independent in other colonies, but not in the Chesapeake. In Barbados, for example, the clergy ignored planter laws forbidding baptism of Africans. Similar church resistance to planter rule occurred in Jamaica, Trinidad, Montserrat, St. Kitts, and Nevis. But the Chesapeake underwent a chain of events that involved the dissolution of the Virginia Company in 1624 and the financial poverty of the Anglican Church after the English Civil War. Both colonial bishops died suddenly. The Church in England lacked funds to appoint new bishops and ship them to the colonies. Colonial rulers seized the opportunity to appoint or unfrock ministers and allowed no independent church to form. In the end, Virginia was the only British colony where planters controlled who was allowed to preach. And Virginia was also the only British colony where the clergy, whose jobs were at stake, followed planter orders and preached against intermarriage and in support of a forcibly endogamous color line.
Speaking of religion, a viewer was taught that the reason Spanish colonists intermarried but British did not is because the former were Catholic and the latter were Protestant.
Sorry. I don't see the connection. Catholic Marylanders joined with Protestant Virginians in enforcing the endogamous barrier, while Protestant colonists in the British West Indies intermarried as consistently as Catholic colonists in the Spanish and French West Indies.
A viewer was taught that Spanish colonists intermarried because they lacked European women. British colonies, on the other hand, included women.
Not so. First, Virginia had about the same proportion of English women as other British colonies in the West Indies, who intermarried freely. Second, white women were generally unavailable either in Virginia or in the British West Indies until about 1620. Finally, even the earliest Spanish conquerors brought their wives on military campaigns, and subsequent shiploads of immigrants from Spain to the New World, amounting to 200,000 to 300,000 souls during the 16th century alone, carried roughly equal numbers of males and females.
I have a question of my own. I did not fully understand how the Spanish used Native Americans as the buffer class.
Chesapeake colonists brought civilization to a land populated by pre-literate hunter-gatherers and early agriculturalists. Their rulers had to create a three-tier slave society from scratch. Spanish colonists conquered two existing militarily powerful empires. Their rulers took over the running of advanced organizations that already had three-tier slave systems in place. Let me add a comment of my own. The origin of the US endogamous color line seems strange, because we expect great results to emerge from great acts and trivial results from trivial acts. Yet here was an act that was done in an apparently offhand manner, without serious forethought, just to keep some forced laborers under control. Only a few people of the time, like Attorney General West, worried about the long-term consequences. The long-term consequences have been dreadful for the United States, of course. Worse yet, after 3 centuries of this bizarre social pathology, Americans are still coming up with fresh new rationalizations as to why it must be preserved for their grandchildren. Many scholars who research this tale feel the same way about it. It was a terrible decision by a few short-sighted men. It would somehow seem more satisfying if the US endogamous color line had begun in some cataclysmic occurrence, a plague, or a war that slew millions, but there you have it. Horrific consequences sometimes spring from trivial events. If there is one lesson to take away from this entire 4-part series is that ordinary Americans did not choose to become racialists. They were forced into it over generations by rulers who worked tirelessly to impose a color line. The older master narrative that white folks despise Africans due to an ancient inborn tendency is obsolete. The evidence shows the contrary. American colonists were as accepting of intermarriage as the British and Spanish until the endogamous barrier was imposed at sword point by their rulers.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting. Well, that is our time for today, ladies and gentlemen. This is Karen Sharp.
And Randolph Hemmings.
Signing off until next time.